Well, hello, Zoom friends. Today we're going to talk about two very exciting documents that you may have a chance to use. We've got the buyer's possession agreement and the seller's possession agreement. So both of these are kind of a change on what typically happens under the contract. Usually, the buyer moves in after closing, the seller moves out, but for one reason or another, you've got a situation where you need to sort of change what happens by default. So both of these documents are RAIN forms to be read in conjunction with the purchase agreement. A couple of things to know about them, and so I'll start with the buyer possession agreement. If you've ever talked with me about it, I guess this is a good time to mention that anytime you're thinking about using one of these, it's probably a good idea to talk to me about it. Me or Susan, just have a conversation with us and fill us in on what's going on so we can make sure that your client is properly advised of the risk that these agreements entail. With the buyer possession agreement, if our clients are the sellers, I tend to disfavor those. Not usually a fan of letting a buyer come in before closing, before they actually own the home. Just tends to, well, the concern is that if somebody has to resort to going to the courts to seek a remedy, I want to do everything I can to avoid that for somebody, and that's the risk. If you've got a list side and the buyers want to get in there early, they're closing on the home that they're selling, and this one's not quite ready, and there's tons of reasons folks do it. I tend to start out with a no. I don't think it's a good idea. And obviously you don't make the decisions for your clients. You explain the risk to them. And that's what we would like to do, is just to explain the risk that, if things don't work out, or they move in and they're unhappy with, they start looking around a little more carefully and aren't pleased with some things, and then you can see all sorts of problems that happen here. But so if you get into it, things you want to make a note of, basically the beginning parts talk about the details of the contract. So you fill all that information in the property, the buyer, seller, listing firm, selling firm, the possession date. So you put down when they're going to be going in. And then there's this blocked off portion here that's very important to make a note of, that unless noted to the contrary in writing, the buyer's possession of the property constitutes fulfillment of the inspection and walkthrough as described in the purchase agreement, and the buyer accepts the property in as is condition. So right there, if there's some things outstanding, you want to make sure that if you're representing the buyer, and if we're on the buyer side, I'm usually okay with telling buyers, yeah, the seller will give you early possession, go for it by all means. But this is something to be aware of. You want to make sure your buyers see this as, hey, you're basically accepting the property in its condition. And you get to closing, you're typically, unless you make a note of that and you put that down in writing beforehand, your buyers are not going to be able to go to the seller and say, oh, hey, by the way, I know closing date is this time. We'd like to go ahead and get some of this work done, or do this, that, or the other. It's not going to happen. Paragraph 4, the security deposit. So if you are in a situation on a list side, I say always get a security deposit. You want to make sure that the buyers have some skin in the game over and above the earnest money deposit. The $500 or whatever it is that they've got there. You want to make sure they've got something else on the line if they're going to go ahead and take possession early. And then the paragraph 4 is where you notate the rental amount. Different ways to come up with that: fair market value of the mortgage on a per diem. Whatever it is, you just want to make sure, I think buyers need to pay for the right to occupy the property early. That's kind of, we all have to pay to live someplace. So definitely make sure that information is filled out there. The termination move out. So if settlement does not occur, paragraph 5 is where you notate basically when the time frame that they have to move. This is a key point here. After written notification, your seller has a buyer in possession. That buyer needs to go ahead and get that formal notice. And usually it'll be that termination agreement saying, hey, this deal's done for whatever reason, it's not going forward. You provide that notice, and then that's when that clock starts ticking. The time for them to actually move out of the property begins after the written notification. And this is kind of an interesting segue to the code actually has a section where it talks about the Virginia Residential Landlord Tenant Act, how it exempts these sorts of transactions, the buyer possession agreement, from that being considered a residential tenancy. So in theory, that means it's a non-residential tenancy, and your client, the seller, could have the remedy of self-help. If any of you have ever dealt with landlord-tenant matters in Virginia, self-help is, in any sort of residential context, it's not allowed. You're not allowed to cut the power off. You're not allowed to go to the property, change the locks, and sort of help yourself to the property. Non-residential tenancies, commercial tenancies, those things are obviously different. And the code actually carved out to agreements like this, where a purchaser is an occupant under a contract to the property. So they anticipated this, and so in theory that means under the buyer possession agreement, if your seller has allowed someone to take possession and the deal falls through, your seller would not have to seek a remedy with the courts to go out and get them out of the property. Practically, I don't know. I mean, that's a risky thing anytime someone asks me about changing the locks on somebody, but at least in theory, the code backs you up on that. Paragraph 6, buyer's responsibilities. This is something also to point out if you happen to represent a buyer when that moves into the property. Basically, all utilities, all repairs, at the bottom part it says the fixtures, equipment, appliances, mechanical, heating, cooling equipment, plumbing and electrical systems, and all other repairs, replacement, and maintenance matters of any type and every nature to the property are now going to be the buyer's responsibility. So something else to be aware of. If they're going to go ahead and take possession early, you want to make sure they understand that the HVAC goes out, it under the contract, it's their problem. And it does say, except those items covered by the seller's hazard insurance. So the seller's policy is still going to be in effect until the closing takes place. They would obviously want to keep their homeowner's insurance in place. The buyers, be advised to get a tenant policy or something to cover them for anything. But also the utilities provision. You want to make sure that the utilities are switched over as well. If you're on the list side and the buyers want to come in, tell your sellers, hey, go ahead and schedule those utility changeovers and make sure to notify the other side so they can go ahead and get the utilities put in their names. They want to occupy the property, they're going to go ahead and they need to be responsible for that. And that's really all the big notes there on the buyer possession agreement, kind of the highlights there. But again, very important that you have your clients talk to us about it, just so that we can make sure that they're fully aware of all the risks. Any questions on the buyer possession agreement before I move over to the seller possession? All hearts and minds.
I don't see anything yet, but clear. Guys, make sure that you don't have to check in whenever you are on here. I can see your names, and of course meetings are never required. They're just highly recommended. So you don't have to check in and put it in the chat, because I keep going to the chat to see what questions are there, and it's everyone checking in. And then if you have anything to say to Austin or Susan, just make sure you give them a call after, if it's not a question. Austin, Jean said she has one right now that's in your email. But just make sure y'all don't put that in there, because I'm trying to look at what questions I need to tell them about. So let's kind of keep it open while they're talking, just for questions so that I can ask them. Austin, I don't see any right now.
Okay.
I think you're good.
So Jean's question in my email is not,
it's not
something else.
Yeah,
oh, okay.
Just FYI.
I was gonna say, okay. I can't see it on my phone.
Yeah, it's okay. It's all right.
All right. So then the seller's possession agreement. So kind of the flip side of that, so you've got an instance where the seller has sold, closings happen, but they're just not quite ready to move out for one reason or another. And again, just like I'm not a huge fan when I represent sellers of letting buyers take possession. Also not a huge fan if I'm representing a buyer of letting the seller remain in possession, basically for the same reason. In the event that seller, for whatever reason, their other plans don't work out, they decide they need to remain in your property for a little bit longer, you're stuck in possibly having to evict them. Something I did notice last night when I was looking at the code section in the BRLTA, it talks about, I mentioned the occupant, or the carve out for occupancy under a contract of sale, if the occupant is the purchaser. So that clearly applies to the buyer possession agreement, but it would not seem on its face to apply to a seller possession agreement. If the occupant is the purchaser, well, in this case, under the seller possession agreement, the occupant is the seller. So the argument there would be that would be not excluded from the applicability of the Virginia Residential Landlord Tenant Act. And therefore, if you needed to get that seller out, you would probably have to resort to the courts to do so, unless trying to maybe put something in the other provisions that state that this would be a non-residential tenancy. So I don't think that was intentional by the legislature. I just don't. I think that they would probably want to include, a seller under that arrangement, but just throwing that out there. So, again, you've got the same information here. It's basically to be read together with the purchase agreement. So you fill in that information there. Paragraph 4, so you settlement date, you've got the move out date. In paragraph 3, you're going to put down when this is supposed to happen. You definitely want to make sure to get a security deposit in those instances. And I tend to advise folks, anytime there's an exchange of money to take place between buyers and sellers, I think it's best to happen on the settlement statement. For a while, I'd heard that lenders were not a huge fan of that, but we've seen multiple instances, and maybe just because of the climate we're in now, where lenders know what's going on and they're fine having those numbers on. They understand that for one reason or other, somebody's going to be taking possession early or remaining in possession late. And that's just the easiest way to really transfer funds, in my opinion, instead of having to try to do the checks outside of closing. There may be some lenders that have an issue with that. And so, of course, that's something you want to run by them. But for our purposes, it's just easiest when we see it as a debit credit on the settlement statement. And that way you don't have to worry about anything taking place afterwards. So definitely want to make sure that sellers are putting down a deposit, because essentially they're still remaining in the property. So you would want to do a walkthrough as of the date of closing, just to get an idea. And of course, it's the seller stuff's going to be there. And then you would schedule a walkthrough, of course, at the end, once they in fact turn over the property. You pay up front, though. Paragraph 4B, there's a daily rental rate to be paid in full at settlement. So you figure out how long they're going to be there, what that rate is going to be, and then collect that money from the seller at that point, all of it. Just go ahead and make sure that is paid over. And then it does, interestingly enough, give the seller the ability to get out of the property early, so they could send notice, leave the property, and then the last sentence, the buyer may, at the buyer's option, refund a portion of the rent. So it doesn't seem to say that the buyer must return that funds, although I think that'd probably be the right thing to do if they terminate early. And then paragraph C is a penalty rent. So you can put in there, if they remain over, basically what the daily rental rate will be at that point. And then that's not collected up front, but you have your security deposit, hopefully, as a buffer to, and again, just sort of an encouragement for them to have a little skin in the game, to want to get out of the property in the right time. Paragraph 5, I mentioned, I don't know how effective it would be, but if at all possible, something we would counsel folks to do is just to put down that it is not a residential tenancy subject to the VRLTA. Buyer shall have the rights to self-help eviction. And at least knowing that that's there could, potentially provide a little more teeth to the agreement. for a seller who may need to make other plans. Paragraph 6, the insurance. So the buyer's insurance is going to be in effect as of the date of closing. That's a requirement. So you want to make sure that is in there. Paragraph 7, you got the move out condition, use of the deposit. So it anticipates doing that final inspection on the move out date, and then confirm the presence of any personal property that maybe the purchaser bought from the seller, and then making sure the property is in the right condition. And then there's a 3-day period after the move out where the buyer releases or says that the deposit is to be released to the seller. Paragraph 8 has utilities. You can negotiate between buyer and seller as far as who's responsible for the utility expenses. In this case, if your buyer isn't taking possession, I don't think they should pay for the utilities at that point. They should remain in the name of the sellers until the sellers move out of the property. Seems to be the fair way, but it gives you the option there to choose. And then, the rest of it pretty straightforward there. So again, just kind of overall, we tend to disfavor those, and of course, there's always going to be instances where some exceptions to the rule, but generally, the party that has the most liability, that the risk of needing to hire a lawyer. And nowadays with evictions, you have to, I can barely figure out the best way to get an eviction in court right now. It's just so many different rules from the CDC, the governor's orders. It used to be you can go to the Code of Virginia and figure out how to do things. It's not the case anymore. And they're changing things right now to sort of adjust to the pandemic. So, the party that stands the chance of needing to hire a lawyer to get into court to evict somebody, that's the person in my mind who has quite a bit of risk there. And, typically you want to try to avoid that risk when you can, or have the party that is causing the risk pay for it, in the form of rent, security deposit, etc. So, that's kind of what I have on the possession agreements.
Okay, Susan,
Any questions?
here, we often see on VA loans that if there is a standard purchase agreement, the rent and security deposit cannot be shown on the CD, and they have to be done outside of closing. So just keep that in mind as you go through that it cannot be on the CD. Adam said, if a court or city deems a property uninhabitable after a ratified contract, what is the best way to protect your buyer client?
Well, if your buyer is under contract to purchase a home that becomes uninhabitable by the city, I think there's a clear way out of there for your buyer.
Yeah.
You should be able to get out pretty easily.
I'm going to play the devil's advocate for a minute on that. If I were representing the seller, I would ask you to point to a provision in the contract, because it doesn't. That's I think a little bit of a defect in the standard purchase agreement is there's nothing in there that says it has to be up to code.
Right there, everybody. That's why Susan Walker is on our team.
I'm not saying I think that's right, but
no, I love it.
Yeah. Now, if the seller has received the notice from the city after giving the disclaimer statement, they are required to notify the buyer if they've gotten any sort of notice from the city, a building code violation. I certainly think uninhabitable is probably meaning they got a condemnation notice. Adam, is that what you had in mind?
Like if the floors have to be shored up, if there's foundation problems, or like a special licensed contractor.
I don't know that the city would necessarily know that. I'm not sure how the city would have gotten involved in that point. I'm more thinking of the situation. I've seen this happen before, where the buyer goes over to the property after signing the contract, and there's a notice from the city, the condemnation notice on the door. They've already, their inspection period's passed. There's not a contingency anymore. That's a little bit of an awkward situation.
Yeah. So what would happen if that's the case? So if like you said, playing devil's advocate, you're right. So the contract doesn't have anything that's really specific to that would say it has to be up to code, right? It would, and the inspection period's passed, negotiations are done, and all of a sudden this shows up on the door. What would happen?
I don't know. I think if I were getting a mortgage, I would very quickly take a copy of that notice to my mortgage company.
Yeah.
But if you're paying cash, it could be a different story. So,
But I mean, if you did pay cash, which is usually the case, because it's usually a house that's lower, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, and you thought that you were going to go in, I mean, boy, that could be, you could think of a, you know, an investor versus the listing agent, you know, that could be quite the battle right there.
I mean, some investors, you know, they know they're going to be doing a total rehab, but you know, getting that condemnation notice on the door is that ups the ante a little bit, because then that means not only your rehab, but now the city's going to have to inspect it beforehand, and you may not have been expecting that. So Austin, I don't know what you think in that situation.
Yeah. I mean, if they've not built that into their calculations on what they were going to have to do to you know, rehab the property, then that could be an issue.
Yeah.
So let's think on our side of the listing side. What could we make sure we write in the contract to assure that it would move forward if that did happen? Is there a specific verbiage that you guys would recommend to add to a contract that would be in both sides, really, right? So we have to think of the investor side, then we have to think of the listing side, right? So what could you add, one, for the buyer side that would allow them to release from the contract later if this did happen? And what would you advise on the listing side that would keep them from releasing on the contract later? Or would the listing side even need it, since it doesn't really talk about it in the standard purchase agreement? What are your guys' opinions on that? You open the worms, Susan. You know how I get. You open the worms.
I mean, a lot of it depends on negotiating power, because if you're on the buyer side in this market, you try to put something in there that, and you try to sort of micromanage to anticipate that possible scenario of, you know, and you say that in the event the house is deemed uninhabitable by the city prior to settlement, buyer may terminate the contract. Well, that's going to worry the seller that the buyer's going to contact the code enforcement division and try to get somebody to come out and inspect it. If I were representing the seller as the listing agent, I would not want to accept that offer, at least not with that verbiage. You know, and again, we're in an investor situation, because if you've got a buyer with a mortgage, there's going to be an appraisal, there's going to be a more formal process they're going through. So I don't know if I would take that kind of, you know, safety net verbiage if I were representing the seller. But you could try that if you're representing the buyer investor who's planning on doing a certain rehab but not doing a complete, you know, up to code overhaul.
Yeah, I think you run the risk if you're on the listing side of putting down the buyer shall continue to be obligated in the event of a condemnation notice posted. You know, I don't know that you want to
more of, you know, how everybody put as it really
Sure.
does it. It's not really verbiage. And I hate it when people do that, as is where it, like, it's just not good verbiage. It doesn't say anything about the different inspection. It's, you know, as is where is doesn't really cover what's needed, and everyone defaults to that. And I don't think that's something that is a very good idea to put in a contract. Like, it's skewed and it's up to interpretation, right?
Yeah, I think you're representing the investor, and it really is as is. You cross out pretty much everything in paragraph 13.
Correct.
You know,
That's
not
correct.
A walkthrough. And you could take paragraph 12 and you could alter that. I'm trying to remember if that requires anything other than personal property and debris to be removed.
Correct.
Yeah, but you would just.
And that's what I like, crossing the things out. Yes. Because just saying it does not take those other things out of it.
Yeah.
And it drives me insane.
Yeah, a lot of times you'll see them put 0 in paragraph 13, put 0 as the cap, but not cross out paragraph 13, and it's meant to be an as is. But even with 0 there, it still gives the buyer the right to get out of the contract, you know, if they do find massive termite damage or something like that.
Yep.
The seller's not willing to pay
Gotta
for it.
cross it out.
Yeah, that's better.
Yep, I agree. I love it. I always describe Susan as, she says, paragraph 9, second sentence in, without even having the contract in front of her. I've been doing this for 16 years and I can't do it. She does it every single time.
No, I don't, because they keep changing it and moving the paragraph.
Yes, you still do it. I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know how you do it. All right, do we have any other questions before we move on to the question and answer period? Okay, all right, I'm going to put the first question up for you, Susan.
Well, after Austin's talk, this Q&A should be just super easy peasy for everyone. So the first question down in your chat is true, false. If this is under a buyer, these first 4 or 5 questions are under the buyer possession agreement. True or false, if the roof springs a leak after the buyer takes early possession, the seller is responsible to fix it. Who is brave enough to vote?
Put your answers in the chat, please. We have one false so far. Come on, guys, answer false. 2 false. 3 false. False. Now it'll just all be false because everyone will
Everybody is
follow suit.
good job. Everyone is very smart, right? As Austin was reading from the contract, the buyer takes over the maintenance responsibility upon taking early possession.
Yep.
So let's see. The second question: if a tree falls on the roof and caves in the roof during the buyer's possession agreement, does the buyer or the seller's insurance cover the claim? And does the buyer or the seller pay the insurance deductible? So first of all, on the claim, is it going to be the buyer or the seller's insurance if the tree falls and caves in the roof? Gene, it still makes it sound.
We have seller.
Okay. Yep. I agree with the votes for seller. And that's because you can't, if you're the buyer, you can get insurance on your stuff, but you don't own the house yet. So you cannot insure the house until you actually own it. So
Yep.
That is correct, everyone.
Good job.
So what about the deductible? So say the seller it's a wind and hail related thing, and that policy, so it's a named storm, the policy knocks the storm knocks the tree over, and the seller's insurance policy has a 2% deductible. So you're looking at, I don't know, $5,000-$10,000 right there. Who is responsible to pay that deductible? Does anyone have a vote on that?
Everyone's saying seller.
Well, I'll have to tell you, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Well, I'll speak on an insurance standpoint. So
Please do. Thank you.
if this is not written in the contract that any deductible that would be assessed on the property during the possession period, it would be paid by the buyer. It's going to be very hard for the seller to get that from the buyer. But on an insurance standpoint, we're going to demand it from the seller. So it's not going to be like, we'll never go after that buyer. That buyer is not named on the insurance policy, right? So no one will ever go after the buyer, even if it's a rental property, which they should have advised their insurance company that now it's a rental. So just FYI, if you are a seller with an early possession agreement, advise your seller. They have to notify the insurance company that it is now a rental property, even if it's just for 30 days. There's different things that are covered and different things that are done. And advise the buyer they need rental insurance while they are in there to cover their possessions during that period. So that has to be switched over. But even at that point, the insurance company will never go after the person in the property for the deductible because the insurance policy follows the person who bought it.
Thank you for that clarification, because as Austin was pointing out under paragraph 6, the buyer has a maintenance responsibility except those covered by seller's hazard insurance. And I was thinking, well, that doesn't really address the deductible.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, but you can write in there that them to, give the deductible. And if you have a home warranty on there, you're going to want to write that in there as well, that if you want them to pay the deductible on that home warranty for anything that would happen, you want to make sure that that's in that contract too, along with, you can let the home warranty companies know that it's okay for the client, the buyer who's living in the property, to call in the claims. You can actually give them permission on the policy to call in the claims and pay for the deductible themselves. And they can just go ahead and take care of calling in whatever they want.
So I guess then you could add in paragraph 7 that any deductibles required by home warranty or homeowner's insurance shall be paid by the buyer.
You could.
If that's what the intention was, maybe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, because I wasn't sure on that. Okay, so the next question is, true or false, the buyer moves in on early possession before the appraisal is complete. The appraisal comes in low. The buyer must close anyway, regardless of appraised value. You think that's true or false?
False, false, true. Oh, we got mixed.
Mixed opinions. Okay, something controversial. So.
Mostly false, but we had a couple truths. So
yeah, to someone who said that it is false want to argue for that? Let's see, who said false?
Jean, you wanna step up to the plate on that one? You're one of the first ones I see on here.
I would say false, and it's a separate agreement. It's not, it's while it's included in the entire agreement, the pre-possession is actually a separate agreement. And I don't think that at that point that the appraisal comes in low, it becomes renegotiable.
Yeah, I mean, it's under paragraph 6. Okay, well, I'm sorry. So that's a false. Let's have someone argue for true. Who wants to argue for true?
Anybody want to argue for true on their thoughts?
See, Una, maybe?
Una, Letitia, Stephanie? Anyone?
Hey, it's Una.
Hey, Una, go ahead. Give us your thoughts.
Sorry. Well, I mean, maybe not as educated as the rest of you yet.
Okay.
But I was assuming that if you're taking early possession, your intention is to be in that property. And so just because it appraises low, below what you thought, I mean, doesn't that bind you in some way?
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective as well. And the reason I put this particular question in here is I think it's an unanticipated problem, and I wouldn't recommend letting the buyer move in early if the appraisal is not done and turned in a
Right.
by the lender because of this potential unanticipated problem. And as Jean was pointing out, it says in paragraph 6, buyer and seller each warranty each other that they will undertake in good faith the actions necessary to complete the sale in accordance with the terms of the purchase agreement. So the purchase agreement is still alive, and there is still that appraisal contingency under the purchase agreement. So I have to agree that the buyer, especially if it's a government loan, does have protection in the event of a low appraisal. But that's certainly something that no one really anticipated. And as you said, Una, the anticipation is the buyer's moving in with the commitment that they're going to go forward with the closing, unless the seller is in default, and the low appraisal is not really a default situation. So that would just be because of the fact that I think they would have the right to get out of the contract. I think you wouldn't let them move in if the appraisal isn't done. That's my advice. I don't know if anybody thinks differently than that.
One of the question was, if the house doesn't appraise, can a loan be denied? Yes, it definitely can be denied. But there's also, other ways to take care of that. They could pay cash for the remainder as well. This is the negotiation period that we were kind of talking about. But I agree, don't ever let somebody move in before we've had the appraisal. That's
we've seen it done, and it creates unanticipated consequences.
Yeah, it does.
Hey, Stephanie here. Sorry, I have a little input if nobody minds. Like Una, I have no experience whatsoever, just passed last Thursday. And this question was basically on the exam. Now, I have no idea if I got it right or wrong, right? Because they don't tell you. But one of the options was, does the person still has to close, and do they have to come up with the extra money? So I don't, you know what I mean? Like, is it true? Is it false? Susan had so much good things to say, like, the whole true false thing. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a separate, I don't think the possession agreement overrides that particular paragraph of the contract. Yeah, I mean, it's still there, it's still part of the contract, and it's still valid and in force. So I don't think you can make them come up with the money.
Yeah, the side contract is for a rental possession for a certain period of time with a beginning and end date of that, with another walkthrough as well. And then separately is your purchase agreement that has not ended and is still standing. And so I feel that paragraph referring to appraisals is still alive and very well fed. So it's not going anywhere. It's not dying.
Okay, and Thomas, you tell me when we run out of time, and then we can just sort of.
Oh, you're good. You're good. I'm going to go ahead and put number 4 up. Everybody loves this. This is their favorite part now of the meeting. So you're good.
So let's see, number 4, buyer may paint the property upon moving in on early possession, true or false?
I have false, false. True.
Ooh, okay. So someone who said, let's see, John, since you said false, could you say why it's false? See if if he's able to unmute. I guess for the
If I
sake of
recall, it needed to be in
Go
the
ahead.
original way it was bid on and wanted the house.
So the question was, if the buyer moves in on early possession, can they go ahead and start painting and tearing up the carpet and doing things like that? You said they cannot, right?
Correct. They shouldn't be able to paint until the actual owner is left the property.
Yeah, and that's under paragraph, I agree with you, that's under paragraph 6C, which says, under buyer's responsibilities, buyers shall not make any alterations, modifications, repairs, or replacements to the property without the advance written consent of the seller. So, yeah, so they shouldn't be able to do that unless the seller has approved it. If let me ask you a question. If the buyer doesn't really need to move in, but and maybe I'm skipping ahead here, but if they don't really need to move in, but they do want to, I'm sorry, this is the next question. Go ahead, Thomasina.
Okay, I'm gonna put it up. I'm gonna put it up. While I'm putting it up though, real quick, John, you had asked if an appraisal comes in super low and they refuse to redo it, is there anything you can do? Yes, you can challenge an appraisal and talk to your mentor about that. They can talk to you about what that means, or any lender can, but talk to your mentor about challenging an appraisal. Okay, put up number 5. Go ahead.
It says true or false. If the buyer wants to paint property prior to closing, there needs to be a possession agreement. Does there need to be a possession agreement just for them to get in and paint? Is that true or false?
We got false, false,
Okay.
false, false. Everyone's false.
Yeah. Now, there is a different document. Does anybody know what the other document is that you can use in a situation where the buyer wants to get in and do some work to the property before closing?
Limited access. Jordan
Yeah, it's
says.
limited access.
Good job,
agenda.
Joe.
Yeah, and it's not one that I guess it may not be used very often because it looks like the last revision date was 2004, looking down at the bottom, but it is there. It's part of your tool.
Wow, 2004, huh?
Yeah, I was surprised. I mean, the standard purchase agreement's probably been revised 12 times since then, and this has not been revised at all. But it is a tool that you can use. You would want to have either one of the attorneys, one of your managers, kind of look over it with you if it's an unfamiliar form before using it. This could be if they need to store stuff in the house, or if they need to, it's a situation where the seller refuses to replace the carpet, but the buyer needs it to be replaced either for appraisal purposes, or they can't move in because of allergies until it's replaced or something, and you want to be done. So that's a form. It's Rain Form LAA, Limited Access Addendum. If you ever wanted to take a look at that in that situation.
All right. What if I paint the unit at the end? There is not closing.
I believe, let's see, that if you do allow improvements, like under the limited access agreement, if you did go into paint, and then the closing doesn't happen, let me see, it talks about what happens in the event of the buyer defaults. Yeah, it says if the buyer defaults or settlement does not occur through no fault of the seller, then if the seller's option, either this buyer has to restore the property or give the seller the benefit of the improvement. So it's up to the seller as to whether the buyer has to go back and repaint it whatever color was there before, or whether they just leave the nicely newly painted house for the seller to benefit them. So it's up to the seller under the limited access addendum.
And what color you choose.
Yeah.
Neon yellow will not go well.
Right.
Will not go well. All right, putting the next question up.
Okay, this is under the seller possession agreement. The seller moves out earlier than required under the seller possession agreement. Does the buyer have to reimburse the seller for the overpaid rent? This is something Austin addressed in his talk
That's
earlier.
a good question. It says at buyer's discretion, but I don't know if that was to the other one or to this one, but I think that it's Joe. It has to be this one, at buyer's discretion.
Yeah, no, that's right, and it's in paragraph, it's under the seller possession agreement, paragraph 4B. It says, if the seller's going to vacate early, seller should give buyer written notice of seller's intent to vacate, and buyer may, at buyer's option, refund a portion of the rent. So that's correct.
Look at that. Joe's on it today, huh? My goodness, she is like spot on. All right, putting up the next question.
All of you are spot on today. Good.
Yeah, they're all doing really good, but she's like very detailed in her answers. I mean, my goodness. All right.
Buzzer fast.
Yeah, I'm like, oh my gosh. She's like, I got the contract in front of her or something. She's doing great. All right, go ahead.
Number 7, it says if the dishwasher breaks, true or false? If the dishwasher breaks during the seller possession agreement, buyer is required to fix it. True or false?
We got true and whoa, we got mixed one. We have discussion.
Discussion.
Okay, if somebody said false, who wants to talk? Nikki, you wanna tell us false?
Because if the seller is in the house, even though the buyer has bought it, it is the seller's responsibility to maintain it and at that point, because they are still owning the house and they're still liable.
Okay, Samantha, you want to tell us why you said true?
Because if you're renting the house out and if it was a dishwasher, something that you conveyed over to the renter, wouldn't you have to take care of it? So would it be the same thing if the buyer owns the house at that point? Wouldn't they would be responsible for taking care of that dishwasher for the seller?
Do either of you know in that contract, in that early possession agreement, where it states that it would back either one of your responses? Do you know where it's at by any chance? Munesh or Sam? I know the answer to this because I had it happen with a toilet forever and ever and ever ago. And I used to teach on it. It's really eye-opening. It's a great question. Susan, go ahead and tell them where it's at and tell them why Sam is correct.
Okay, paragraph 8.
She's right.
Paragraph 8, under utilities maintenance repair, the second sentence says, other than is specifically set forth in this paragraph, buyers shall have the maintenance and repair responsibility for the property, including all appliances, heating, cooling equipment, etc., after the settlement date, except damage caused by the seller. So yeah, it does turn into more like a tenancy. The seller now becomes a tenant in their own home. The buyer is like the landlord, and it seems counterintuitive. I totally understand that. That's kind of why it's important to know these little fine print things that Austin was bringing out in these documents. So,
yeah, it's definitely, it was eye-opening whenever I did it too. I was like, ooh, it was years ago, but I was like, wow, that's
right.
quite
It's not what anybody expects. So, but it's there.
All right, last question. Good job, Sam, by the way. Good job.
Thank you, Munesh, for arguing the point. That was good too. So, number 8, let's see here. Is it up? Yeah.
Can you see it?
Oh, I can't. Let me scroll down here.
Oh no, that's because some reason it went private. I don't know why that. Someone must have messaged me privately, and it turned me to private. Hold on, let me put it up here again. Sorry. All right, go ahead. There it is. Sorry about that.
Number 8, true or false? The buyer should not perform the walkthrough until the seller has moved out at the end of the possession period.
False. Lucy, you can't put the answer first. Everyone's gonna follow you. That's our broker. We have true and false. Okay, so they did not follow Lucy, contrary to my popular belief of what would happen on that one. Okay, so we got false and true. I'm trying to see who has true. We already talked to Sam. Adam, do you want to argue the true point?
Sure. Sorry. I guess that you just want to limit assumptions, generally speaking, with contracts. So the more limitations on assumptions, the better. I guess it's kind of a general. I don't know if that counts.
Sam, do you want to add a little bit of input on that too? Sorry to tell you, you were on.
No, it's okay. Shouldn't you do one before they take possession and one after in case there's anything that happened in that period of time?
Okay, so I'm gonna let that sit there with those two. And Lucy, go ahead for the false.
The contracts with regards to your walkthrough repairs, your PICRA repairs and all of that has to happen before the buyer takes possession or before the buyer closes. Once that closing happens, the condition of the home is the condition of the home. Only things that are remedied are things that are damaged during the tenancy of the seller. So if the buyer does not complete their walkthrough showing that the property is in the same condition it was when they wrote the contract and that all their PICRA repairs are done, once they close, too bad, so sad, they got no remedy on that. And then you do the walkthrough at the end when the seller moves out per the possession agreement. There's a second page or the last page to the possession agreement that's all about the move out inspection. And sorry about the noise, I'm getting carpet installed out there.
We can't hear it, you're all right. All right, Susan.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Austin and I had this conversation last night, and you know, we were saying that if there are some, you should definitely do the walkthrough to see if the repairs are done, because the buyer does become the landlord at that point. But if there's something that's not done, you can make it survive. You just need to write that into the walkthrough report or into the possession agreement or someplace so that that obligation still survives until the end of the possession period. So yes, do the walkthrough. If there's something that the seller still needs to finish, make sure it's written that that survives the closing and will be completed before the end of the possession period.
Very good. All right, so did everybody understand that the seller is staying in the property after closing and doing a lease back to the buyer now who owns the property? There was a walkthrough upon the closing of the property from the seller to the buyer, and things may not have been done. You have to write in that it's going to survive and go on to the lease agreement and that it would be repaired during that time. Then now that it's switched and the buyer is now the owner, the original seller is now the leasee, right? Leasee. They are going to have to do another walkthrough at the end to make sure everything's done, because now the only thing that survived in the original contract was what you wrote in, right? For it to survive for additional repairs and anything that has happened, obviously, while the old seller is now the leasee going through this time period. So you're going to do another walkthrough. Jean put within 3 days of move out. And I do think it does state days. Is it 3, Susan? I don't know off the top of my head. I'm going to trust her on that one, but
I think I remember that from last.
You've got 3 days to release the, oh, I'm sorry. You've got 3 days to release the deposit after the move out date.
release the deposit. Okay.
That's
Okay.
it.
Not the walk, just to release the deposit. Okay. I remember days being in there, but I couldn't remember what it was. Okay. Good. I'm glad you had it there. Perfect. Perfect. All right. Do we have any more questions for Susan and Austin? We already have one awesome question and answer period. I'm telling you, they love this. They do. They really love it. So, do you all have any other questions you want to write in here, or you want to unmute yourself and ask? No? All right. Thank you, Austin and Susan. I really